The summer of 1883 baked the New Mexico territory in a cruel copper heat. The air itself seemed to shimmer over the dry plains, carrying the scent of dust, sweat, and desperation. Inside the Weston ranch house, the heavy curtains were drawn against the sun, but they couldn't keep out the truth. Ruin had finally come knocking. Clara Weston stood at the parlor window, clutching the thin lace of her mother's old curtain. She was 19, pale from too many seasons spent indoors learning the proper ways of a lady. Piano, embroidery, French, all the things her father once said would make her fit for a fine husband. But there were no fine husbands now. Only debts, rumors, and the sound of her father arguing with a man she didn't recognize in the next room. The stranger's voice was low and steady. Her father's was not. "I told you I'd pay it back," Henry Weston snapped. "You can't take her. She's my daughter." The stranger didn't raise his tone. "You had your chance, Weston. The law says you owe me more than you can pay in 10 lifetimes. Clara pressed her ear to the doorframe. Her stomach twisted. She'd known her father was gambling again. Cards, whiskey, nights in town. But she hadn't realized just how deep the hole went. A long pause followed, broken only by the creak of boots on wood. Then came a name she hadn't heard in years. Jace Redhawk. Her heart stilled. That name had always carried a hush around it in this town. The half-Apache ranch hand who'd once worked for her father, and then vanished after some scandal no one dared speak of plainly. Some said he'd stolen cattle. Others whispered worse. But Clara remembered him differently. Tall, quiet, with eyes like storm clouds over the desert, the kind of man who seemed to see through people instead of around them. "What's he got to do with this?" her father demanded. The stranger replied, "He's the only man willing to settle your debt. His condition is simple. Your daughter for his wife." The words dropped like a branding iron in Clara's chest. Before she could think, she burst into the room. "No, you can't." Her father turned, face red, whiskey-sour breath catching in his throat. "Clara, stay out of this." But the stranger looked straight at her. A tall man in a long duster, his badge half hidden under the coat. The sheriff. "I'm sorry, Miss Weston," he said almost gently. "You know your father signed the note. The law won't spare him. Or you." Clara's knees went weak. "Marry him? An Apache?" The word felt cruel in her mouth, but she couldn't stop it. That's how she'd been taught to say it. Like it meant outlaw, savage, less than human. But somewhere in the back of her mind flickered the memory of a young man leading her horse through a flooded river. When she was 13, his hand steady on the reins, his voice calm while her father shouted from the shore. That had been Jace Redhawk, and now, 6 years later, she was being sold to him. Her father slumped into a chair, gray and defeated. "I don't have a choice, Clara," he muttered. "You'll be taken care of. He's not a bad man." She stared at him in disbelief. "Not a bad man?" "You're giving me away to clear your gambling debt." The sheriff shifted uncomfortably. "You'll be married by dawn, Miss Weston. He'll meet you at the chapel," and that was that. The room fell silent except for the ticking of the mantel clock and the muffled wail of wind against the walls. Clara ran to her room, her mind burning with anger and humiliation. She tore the white dress from her chest and wept until her voice gave out. She thought of the life she'd dreamed of. San Francisco music, a husband with clean hands and a gentle smile. But those dreams felt like dust now, scattered by her father's sins. When dawn came, the sun rose over the desert in blood-red streaks, and Clara Weston rode toward the small chapel at the edge of town. She was 19, barefoot beneath her torn hem, her heart beating with fear and defiance, and waiting for her at the altar was the man she was supposed to hate. The chapel sat on the far edge of Dust Creek, a small, leaning building that looked more like a grave marker than a house of God. Its white paint had long peeled to gray, and the bell in its steeple hadn't rung since the last funeral, a miner who'd died under a cave-in 2 winters before. Now that same silence waited to swallow Clara Weston whole. Her hands shook as she dismounted from the wagon. The sheriff stood beside her, hat in hand, trying to meet her eyes but failing. No bridesmaids, no flowers, no mother's guiding touch. Only the wind, the sand, and a handful of crows circling overhead. She turned once, searching the horizon as if she might still find a way to run. But there was nothing out there except dry earth and the life she no longer owned. And then she saw him. Jace Redhawk stood near the chapel steps, tall and still, his broad shoulders outlined by the rising sun, His shirt was clean but patched at the elbows and his boots were worn thin. A single braid of black hair fell down his back, tied with a strip of leather. His face was sun-darkened, roughened by wind and work. But his eyes, those gray, thunderous eyes, watched her with something she couldn't name. Not triumph, not anger, maybe pity. "Miss Weston," he said quietly when she approached. She didn't answer. Her throat was dry. The sheriff gestured toward the door. "Let's get this done before the heat comes up." Inside, the air smelled of cedar and dust. The preacher waited by the altar, his hands trembling as he thumbed through his worn Bible. "Morning, folks," he muttered, not meeting Jace's eyes. Everyone in town knew who the groom was, the half Apache who'd once worked for the Westons until trouble found him. Clara felt their silence as judgment, sharp as a knife. Jace took his place beside her. He didn't reach for her hand. He stood like a soldier, his jaw set, his presence steady as a mountain. She could feel the warmth of him, the quiet power in his stillness. For some reason, that steadiness unnerved her more than anger would have. The preacher cleared his throat. "We are gathered here." He stopped, looked at the empty benches, and sighed. "Well, the Lord is here, and that'll have to do." Clara's heart twisted. The room was ghostly quiet. The only sound was the slow tick of the preacher's pocket watch. Outside, a horse snorted. Somewhere, a tumbleweed scraped against the door. When the vows came, her lips trembled. "I, Clara Weston, take thee." The words caught in her throat. She could feel Jace's eyes on her, steady, unflinching. The preacher gave her a sympathetic nod, urging her to continue. "Take thee, Jace Redhawk, to be my husband." It sounded like someone else speaking, some other woman's life she'd stepped into by mistake. Then it was his turn. His voice was low, deep, calm. "I, Jace Redhawk, take thee, Clara Weston, to be my wife, to keep you safe, to give you my word." It was the only time he looked directly at her, and in that gaze she felt something disarmingly real. A kind of quiet promise, not of love, but of honor. It confused her more than anything. The preacher mumbled the final blessing, closed his book, and muttered, "You may kiss your bride." Jace didn't move. He only bowed his head slightly. "Not here," he said softly, almost respectfully. Clara nodded, relieved and strangely disappointed at the same time. She expected him to drag her outside, to claim her like she was a prize. But he didn't. He simply stepped aside, motioning toward the door. Outside, the sheriff waited, eyes downcast. "That's it," he said gruffly. "You're husband and wife now." He turned to Jace. "Keep her safe, Redhawk. And stay clear of town. You know how folks are." Jace gave a short nod, then turned to Clara. "We ride north," he said, "before the sun gets cruel." She followed him because she had no choice. The chapel door creaked shut behind them, sealing the vows she hadn't wanted. As they rode away, Clara looked back once. The chapel grew smaller and smaller against the horizon, until it was only a pale smudge in the heat. The life she'd known disappeared with it, and ahead, in the endless stretch of red earth and wind, rode the man she was now bound to, a stranger who had just rewritten her fate. The sun was already high when they left Dust Creek behind. The town shrank to a blur of wood and smoke in the distance, swallowed by the great empty horizon. The wind tasted of dust and iron. Every hoofbeat on the hardpan echoed like the ticking of a clock counting down to a life Clara didn't want. She sat stiffly on the wagon bench beside Jace Redhawk, her gloved hands gripping the edge until her knuckles turned white. Her wedding ring, a thin band of plain brass, glinted mockingly in the sunlight. He had given it to her without ceremony, without words. It didn't fit quite right. Nothing about this fit quite right. They rode for hours in silence. The road north wound through dry gullies and rocky hills, the land itself as harsh as the people who tried to tame it. Every so often, Clara glanced at her husband from the corner of her eye. He rode with the ease of someone born to the saddle, one hand loose on the reins, the other resting on his thigh. His hat shaded his face, but she could see the sharp line of his jaw, the bronze of his skin, the faint scar near his temple. He looked nothing like the men she'd grown up around. Not polished, not soft, not afraid. That unsettled her most of all. Finally, she broke the silence. "How far?" He didn't look at her. "Half a day's ride. Up in the San Andres foothills. You live alone?" He nodded. She swallowed. "Why?" This time he did glance at her, and for a heartbeat she wished he hadn't. His eyes were steel gray, deep and unreadable. Because men don't ask as many questions that way. The words landed like stones between them. She turned away, staring out at the wide, desolate country. The heat rippled off the sand, and far in the distance a vulture drifted in lazy circles. As the hours passed, fatigue settled into her bones. Her dress, still the white one she'd worn to the chapel, was streaked with dirt and sweat. Her veil had long since blown off into the wind. Every jolt of the wagon reminded her of what she'd lost. Her home, her name, her place in the world. But beneath the bitterness, another feeling began to stir, something quieter, heavier. Curiosity. She'd expected Jace to be cruel, to boast, to gloat over his prize. But he hadn't said a word beyond necessity. When the wheel hit a rut, he'd reached out, steadying her shoulder without even looking, his touch firm but careful. He hadn't tried to own her. If anything, he seemed to be keeping a distance she couldn't understand. Around midday, they stopped near a creek that cut through the valley like a silver thread. Jace climbed down first, then offered her a hand. She hesitated, then took it. His palm was calloused, rough with years of work, but there was something grounding in it, something steady in a world that had suddenly turned upside down. "You should drink," he said simply. "The road gets meaner ahead." She knelt at the water's edge, cupping the cold stream in her hands, and for the first time in 2 days, she realized how thirsty she was. When she looked up, Jace had untied a small bundle from the back of the wagon, hard bread, jerky, and an apple that had seen better days. He handed her the apple. "It's yours," she frowned. "Aren't you eating?" He shrugged. "Had my share earlier." Something in his tone told her that wasn't true. They rode again in silence until the land began to rise, hills turning to ridges, ridges to cliffs. As evening fell, they reached a small cabin nestled against a slope of red rock. Smoke curled faintly from a chimney. It wasn't much. 1 room, a corral, a half-built barn, but it looked solid, cared for. "This is home," he said quietly. Clara climbed down, staring at the little structure. A hawk cried somewhere above, and the air smelled of pine and smoke. "Home," she echoed under her breath, feeling the word like a stone in her mouth. Behind her, Jace unloaded the supplies, his movements slow and deliberate. The silence between them wasn't empty anymore. It was heavy, charged, like the moment before a summer storm. And as the last light of day painted the desert gold, Clara Weston realized that her exile had begun. But deep inside, where pride and fear couldn't reach, something far more dangerous had begun too. Curiosity. About the man she'd been forced to call husband. The first nights at the cabin passed like dreams Clara couldn't wake from. Long stretches of quiet broken only by the sound of wind, moving through the pines and the low hum of crickets in the dark. Jace Redhawk spoke little. He rose before dawn, his shadow slipping past her window before the first light touched the ridge. By the time she stirred from the cot he'd given her, a narrow one in the corner, covered in a rough wool blanket, he'd already be outside tending the horses, mending fences or hauling water from the spring. He worked like a man who didn't believe in rest, and he moved with the kind of patience that made her restless just watching him. Clara wasn't used to silence. Back home, her father's ranch had been full of noise, ranch hands laughing, pots clanging in the kitchen, her father shouting orders across the yard. Here, every sound carried weight. The scrape of a chair, the thump of boots on wood, the creak of the old door when he came in at night. At first, she resented it. The stillness. Him. She busied herself sweeping, cooking, pretending she wasn't counting the hours until he came back each evening. When he did, he'd remove his hat politely at the door, wash his hands in the basin, and eat the meal she prepared with quiet gratitude. No criticism, no demands, just a soft "thank you, ma'am" before falling silent again. It unnerved her. She didn't know how to hate a man who refused to be cruel. One evening, while cleaning, Clara discovered a small trunk tucked beneath his cot. She shouldn't have opened it. She knew that, but something in her refused to live in ignorance any longer. She lifted the lid carefully. Inside lay a few worn shirts, a bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon, and a book. A Bible, thick with dust. She pulled it out, turning it over in her hands. It was old, the cover cracked from years of handling. When she opened it, she froze. Every line of English scripture had been carefully written again below it in another language, Apache. Her breath caught. The handwriting was steady, careful, reverent. Whoever had done this had taken time, years perhaps, to translate word for word. Find something worth reading? Clara gasped and turned. Jace stood in the doorway, his face half in shadow. She hadn't heard him return. I didn't mean to pry, she stammered, closing the Bible quickly. I was just cleaning. He nodded once, stepping into the room. His gaze fell on the book, and something unreadable flickered in his eyes. My mother taught me to read both, he said quietly. Said the Lord spoke in all tongues if you listened close enough. Clara hesitated. Your mother? She was Apache. He looked toward the window where the last light of day spilled across the floor. Half. My father was white, a preacher from Kansas who thought he could save the desert. The desert didn't want saving. There was no bitterness in his tone, only calm acceptance. Clara found herself studying him, really seeing him for the first time. The quiet strength in his shoulders, the precision in his movements, the calm that came not from gentleness but from survival. She realized then that his silence wasn't emptiness. It was control. You hate me, he said suddenly. The bluntness caught her off guard. She stopped. I don't even know you. He nodded again as if that were answer enough. Then maybe that's a start. He picked up the Bible and placed it back in the trunk, his movements careful, respectful. You can ask me what you need to know. I won't lie to you. Clara's throat tightened. Why did you agree to marry me? You could have let my father hang himself with his own debts. Jace paused. For a long moment he said nothing. Then softly, because a man once saved me when I didn't deserve it. I figured it was time I returned the favor. He turned away, leaving her with the fading glow of the lamp and a heart pounding too hard for comfort. That night, as the wind whispered through the cracks in the cabin walls, Clara couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about the quiet man sleeping on the other side of the room, a man shaped by two worlds, belonging to neither, and about how for the first time since the wedding, her anger had started to give way to something far more dangerous, understanding. 3 weeks passed before Clara saw another soul besides Jace. The isolation had a way of stretching time, of making each day feel like a lifetime and each night something between peace and punishment. By then, the fear that had first kept her awake had softened into a strange rhythm. The sound of his boots in the morning, the smell of coffee boiling on the stove, the creak of saddle leather as he left for the pastures. He'd built her a small table for reading and mending clothes. He'd even started teaching her the Apache names for things. Tusa for fire, Tu for water, Da for wind. She didn't tell him that she whispered them to herself at night. One afternoon, as she was hanging laundry on the line, she heard the distant rattle of wheels on the trail. A horse-drawn wagon was climbing the ridge, kicking up a slow-moving cloud of dust. Jace was out fixing a fence by the creek, so she shaded her eyes with one hand and waited. The wagon came to a stop a few yards from the cabin. A grizzled trader climbed down, gray-bearded and sunburned, with a rifle strapped across his back and a toothpick between his teeth. Well, I'll be, he said, giving her a friendly nod. Didn't expect to see a Weston girl up here. Thought your kin were too high on the hog for mountain living. Clara stiffened. You know me? He grinned. Everyone in Dust Creek knows the Westons. Your pa's cards didn't stay quiet in that town. She flushed, ashamed. You've come to trade? He nodded, glancing around. That I have. Red Hawk here owes me a few pelts, and I've got coffee, sugar, and a few stories to trade in return. She hesitated before calling out for Jace. When he appeared, shirtless under the afternoon sun, a streak of sweat cutting through the dust on his shoulder, the trader's grin faltered. Didn't think I'd find you still kicking. Red Hawk, he said, his voice half wary, half amused. Word was you lit out for Mexico after what happened with the Weston herd. Jace's expression didn't change. Stories travel faster than truth. The trader chuckled uneasily. So they do. But folks back in town say plenty. You stole 20 head, they say. Shot a ranch hand, too. Clara felt a coldness crawl up her neck. That's not true, is it? She asked quietly. Jace didn't answer. He simply handed the trader a small bundle of pelts and turned away. The trader took the cue and busied himself unloading supplies. Sugar, salt, a tin of coffee, and a small bolt of cloth. As he packed up to leave, He leaned toward Clara. "Don't put too much stock in gossip, miss," he said lowly. "But you might want to ask your pa sometime how much a man's word costs in Dust Creek. I reckon you'll find your new husband paid the highest price of any man there." And with that, he tipped his hat and rode off down the trail. That night, Clara waited until Jace finished his supper before speaking. The firelight danced across his face, catching the faint lines at the corners of his eyes. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked softly. He didn't look up. "Tell you what? That my father's debt wasn't about cards. That you—" She stopped, swallowing hard. "That you were punished for something you didn't do." Jace set his plate aside and leaned back in his chair. "Would it matter?" "Yes," she said, almost angrily. "Because I've been sitting here thinking you saved yourself by marrying me. But it sounds like you were saving him." He looked into the fire for a long time before speaking. "Your father was driving cattle through Apache land years ago. A raiding party came down from the hills. I was there. I pulled him from the crossfire. When the smoke cleared, 2 ranch hands were dead. Your father said it was me." Clara's heart clenched. "Why?" "He needed someone to blame. The town wanted blood. I gave it to them by leaving." The fire popped. The silence that followed was heavier than any storm. At last, she whispered, "You could have let him face what he did. Why take me then?" He looked at her, his eyes softer now, but no less distant. "Because every man deserves one chance to do right, even the ones who never took theirs." She didn't answer. Couldn't. She only sat there, the fire's warmth on her face and a chill deep in her chest, realizing that everything she'd been taught about justice, about honor, about men like him, might have been built on lies. Outside, the wind rose, whispering through the trees like the voices of ghosts, and Clara Weston began to understand that the frontier had more laws than the ones written down, and Jace Redhawk had broken none of them. The storm came without warning. One moment the sky was clear. The next it darkened as though the mountains themselves had risen to block the sun. Winds tore across the plateau, carrying dust and grit that stung Clara's eyes and settled into every fold of her dress. Jace Redhawk was already outside, wrestling with the cabin shutters and the barn doors. He moved with a calm urgency, precise and practiced, the kind of movements only years of survival could teach. Clara tried to help, but the wind snatched the tools from her hands, the wood from her grasp, and nearly threw her to the ground. "Stay inside," Jace shouted over the roar. His voice was strong, steady, but it carried a sharp edge that brooked no argument. She obeyed, dragging herself through the cabin door as the storm began to howl like a living thing. Once inside, Clara lit the lantern and pressed herself against the wall, shivering not from the cold but from fear. The cabin creaked under the wind, the roof groaning like it might lift off the ground at any moment. Every rattling shudder and whipping gust sent her heart racing. She had never felt so powerless. Then the door burst open with a violent slam. Dust and rain blew into the room, and there he was, Jace soaked, mud caked on his boots and hands, eyes bright with urgency. Without a word, he grabbed her hand, leading her to the fireplace where the flames, though small, fought valiantly against the cold draft. He knelt in front of her, his shoulders broad even in the dim lamplight, his face shadowed but intense. "Clara," he said quietly, almost a whisper, "you have to stay low. The cabin will hold if we stay together." Her hands shook as she nodded. For the first time since the forced wedding, she felt the full weight of her situation. Not just the storm outside, but the life she had been thrust into. Dangerous, uncertain, unprotected. And the man who had become her shield without a word of complaint. Hours passed like this, the storm pounding against the roof and walls, rattling every board. She couldn't help watching him. The way his fingers worked on the fireplace, the way his eyes scanned the cracks in the walls as if he could read the building itself. He moved through chaos like a river through stone, steady, unyielding, unafraid. At one point, a gust tore the shutter from its hinges. Clara screamed, but Jace was there in an instant, slamming the wood back in place, bracing it with his shoulder. She could feel the strength in him, not just physical but something deeper. Courage, resolve, honor. When the worst of the storm passed, he finally sank into the floor beside her, exhausted, rain dripping from his hair. He didn't speak for a long time. The silence was different now, heavy, yes, but no longer filled with fear. It was the silence of understanding, of shared survival. Clara, staring at him, felt a stirring she had not anticipated. Anger, resentment, and humiliation had melted away, leaving something else. Awe, gratitude, and the faintest spark of admiration. Her pulse raced, and she realized, with both dread and an inexplicable thrill, that she had begun to see him not as a stranger, not as the man who had been forced upon her, but as someone who had kept her alive through the night when she thought no one could. Finally he spoke, voice low, almost tender. "You're safe now." She met his gaze, searching for anything, for cruelty, for mockery, for disdain. There was none. Only the weight of his words and the unshakable truth behind them. I didn't think," she began, but he cut her off gently. "Neither did I. But the night has a way of showing what really matters." And for the first time, Clara Weston understood that survival, courage, and trust were more powerful than law or custom. In the fierce, unforgiving wilderness of the frontier, the man beside her had defied the storm, and in doing so, had shattered every expectation she had ever held about men, marriage, and the limits of honor. She leaned back against the wall, exhausted, trembling, not from the cold this time, but from the realization that something profound had begun between them, something she could neither control nor deny. Outside, the wind finally began to die down. The sky, bruised purple and gold, promised a new dawn. Inside the cabin, for the first time since her forced marriage, Clara felt the faintest flicker of hope. The night was still, almost impossibly so, as if the desert itself held its breath. The storm had passed, leaving the earth steaming and the air scented with wet pine and dust. Clara sat on the cabin floor, knees pulled to her chest, listening to the soft crackle of the dying fire. Jace moved quietly around the room, tending to the lantern, stacking firewood, and checking the doors and windows. Every movement was deliberate, controlled. A man in command of himself and his surroundings. Clara couldn't help but watch him, doubting the strength in his shoulders, the calm precision in his hands, the way his eyes scanned the room with an instinctive awareness, and yet, for all his power, there was something restrained in him tonight, something almost painfully gentle. "You should rest," he said softly, without turning to her. "I can't," Clara admitted, voice barely above a whisper. "I'm too tense, too scared." He came to sit beside her, careful not to crowd her space. The firelight flickered across his face, revealing the faint scar near his temple, the high cheekbones, the stormy gray eyes that seemed to see too much and too little all at once. "Clara," he said quietly, "you don't have to be afraid of me. Not here, not with me." Her pulse quickened and she found herself staring at him, searching for something she couldn't name. Anger? Defiance? Fear? Maybe all three. But beneath it, buried deep, was curiosity. And something else. Something dangerous. He leaned closer, but not in the way a man in the frontier might have. He didn't touch her roughly, didn't assert himself in the way society had taught her to expect. Instead, he paused, looking at her with a respect that felt almost shocking. "I won't hurt you," he said, voice low, deliberate. "I'll never do anything you don't want." Clara's heart thudded in her chest. She had expected force, domination, control. That had been the law of the frontier. Men took what they wanted, women obeyed or suffered. But Jace broke every law she had ever known. And yet the tension in the room was electric. She could feel it coil around them like a living thing. "You don't understand," she whispered, barely audible. "I was supposed to hate you." He shook his head slightly, almost ruefully. "I know." The silence stretched between them, heavy and charged. And then, almost without thinking, Clara moved closer. He didn't resist, but he didn't initiate either. He let her set the pace, let her courage, wise, or curiosity, or need, guide the moment. For the first time since their marriage, the cabin no longer felt like a prison. It was a place of choice, of possibility, of unspoken promises. The fire crackled. The wind whispered outside, and in the shadows a bond began to form, delicate, fragile, yet undeniable. He spoke then, his voice barely more than a murmur. "You could walk away. You know that. The choice is yours." She shook her head almost involuntarily. I don't want to," and he nodded. No further words were needed. The room was quiet, but for the fire, for the distant cry of a coyote, for the heartbeat of a woman who realized she was beginning to trust the man she had been forced to marry. That night, Jace Redhawk shattered every expectation, every law, Every assumption Clara had ever held about men, marriage, and the harsh rules of the frontier, not with force, not with fear, not with dominance, with respect, with patience, with the quiet, steady courage of a man who had lived through storms far greater than the one that raged outside, and emerged unbroken. Clara closed her eyes, letting herself feel it, the safety, the awe, the strange pull of something forbidden yet entirely right. She knew, even as the fire burned low, that nothing would ever be the same. Not the cabin, not the desert, not her. And as the first tendrils of dawn began to lighten the sky, she realized something dangerous and exhilarating. She might already be falling. The dawn broke pale and fragile over the ridges, the red desert glowing like embers. Clara had just stirred from a restless sleep when the sound reached her. Hooves pounding, a distant steady thunder rolling across the valley. She froze, heart hammering. The wind carried the scent of horses, sweat, and gunpowder. She ran to the cabin window and squinted. Dust plumes were rising from the trail, 4 riders approaching fast. Jace appeared behind her, already alert. His face was calm but sharp, the kind of calm that promised danger to anyone foolish enough to challenge it. "They're from town," he said quietly, his voice low but hard. "Your father's men." Clara's stomach lurched. "They're coming for you." "Not just me," Jace replied, his eyes narrowing. "For both of us." Within minutes, the riders had arrived, surrounding the cabin. Guns rested across saddles, eyes scanning the horizon. Clara's father emerged, tall and red-faced, flanked by a posse of angry ranch hands. "Clara!" her father shouted, voice breaking with anger and fear. "Come home, this man. He's not your husband. He's a thief!" Clara's breath caught. She looked at him, the man who had sold her to Jace to cover his debts, and for the first time in weeks, she felt something stronger than fear. Defiance. "No," she said, voice firm and unwavering. "He is my husband. I chose to stay." The sheriff, who had accompanied the posse, hesitated, shifting uneasily. "Miss Weston." Clara's eyes met Jace's, and she saw the unspoken question there. "Are you certain?" "Yes," she whispered. The tension crackled like lightning over the desert. Guns were drawn. The posse's leader, a wiry ranch hand, took a step forward. "Step aside, Red Hawk," he warned, "or we'll do it for you." Jace didn't flinch. He stepped out from the cabin, standing tall, unarmed. His gaze swept over the men, steady and unyielding. "You're not taking her," he said quietly, yet every word carried the weight of the mountains themselves. For a long moment, no one moved. Then the first shot rang out, a warning, a crack in the still morning. Jace didn't duck. He simply moved with the precision of someone who knew exactly what danger was and how to survive it. Clara's father stepped forward, fear overtaking reason. "She's my daughter. You can't." Jace's voice was calm but steel under the words. "She's not yours to claim." "She never was," the posse faltered. The sheriff raised his hands, his own gun trained on the men. Murmurs spread through the group. The story of Jace Red Hawk, the man accused of theft and death, the half-Apache outcast, had been whispered for years. Now face to face with the man they thought a criminal, their certainty began to crumble. Clara's father's face twisted with shame and rage. This is madness." Jace didn't answer. He stayed between Clara and the riders, a living shield of quiet courage. For the first time, Clara saw the full measure of him. Not just the man who had survived the desert storms, the one who had tended her after the night of terror, but the man who could face 100 angry voices and not flinch, because he knew the truth and the law of honor in his own heart. The tension broke in an instant when one of the riders, an older man with gray hair, muttered, "He saved your life once, Weston. Remember that?" Clara's father froze. The posse exchanged uncertain glances. Doubt had begun to erode the anger. Finally, the leader lowered his rifle reluctantly. "You've got her. For now," he said, spitting on the dirt. "But know this, and the town won't forget, Red Hawk." Jace didn't respond. He walked back to Clara, offering his hand. She took it without hesitation. As the riders turned their horses toward the trail, Clara realized something profound. The law of the frontier, as the town understood it, had nothing to do with justice nor with honor. Jace had shown her that true courage wasn't in following the law blindly. It was in protecting what mattered, even when every expectation said otherwise. That morning, The desert sun rose higher, red and fierce, and in its light Clara Weston understood something she had never before allowed herself to feel. She would follow this man, this husband she had been forced to marry, anywhere, through storms, through danger, through every law of the frontier that had once bound them both. The ridge was quiet now, except for the occasional whistle of the wind through the jagged rocks and the soft nicker of Jace's horse. Clara rode beside him, her fingers brushing the reins with a nervous energy she couldn't quite hide. The sun was dipping low, painting the desert in shades of blood orange and purple, and for the first time in weeks, she felt the desert's vastness as something other than a trap. Her father had remained behind, too proud to follow, too ashamed to speak. The town's posse had returned down the trail, their whispers still lingering like smoke in her mind. But here on the ridge above the canyons, the world felt stripped of judgment and fear. "Why didn't you tell them?" she asked, suddenly breaking the quiet. Jace glanced at her, eyes calm, gray, implacable. "Tell them what?" "That you saved my father. That all those lies, all the rumors, none of it was true." He shrugged, but there was no bitterness in the motion. Would it have made a difference? People only believe what they want to. The truth. Sometimes it just sits at the bottom of the well. Clara's heart ached at the thought of how he had been treated, how easily a man's honor could be twisted into shame. "You paid for their lies," she said softly, "and for my father's mistakes." He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached the corral at the top of the ridge and led the horses inside. Then finally he turned to her and Clara saw it, the weight he had carried for years, the quiet stoicism forged from betrayal, the unspoken pain. "I didn't marry you to punish anyone," he said quietly, voice almost lost to the wind. "I married you because some debts aren't owed in money. Some debts are owed in courage." She blinked, unsure if the words were meant for her or for himself. And yet, in the simplicity of them, she understood something she hadn't before. That Jace's life had been a series of tests, each one shaping him into a man who could survive storms, literal and figurative, and still choose honor over vengeance. The sun dipped lower, and the shadows of the ridge stretched across the valley. Clara watched him, this man she had once feared, once resented, now standing not as a stranger or a forced husband, but as someone who had saved her in every way that mattered. Then the riders arrived, not from town this time, but a few traders who had passed through the region and brought word of Jace's courage. They didn't ride with guns drawn, but with respect in their posture, their eyes quietly acknowledging what they had once doubted. "You're a man of your word, Red Hawk," one said. "I heard what you did for the girl. You didn't owe them anything, but you saved a life anyway." Jace nodded, his face calm. Clara's father, standing behind the men, looked on with a strange mixture of awe and shame. He had never seen courage like this, never measured a man's value in deeds rather than words. Clara felt a rush of emotion. The man she had been forced to marry, the one the town had scorned, had not only survived their judgment but had rewritten the rules for them all. His honor, his courage, his unwavering sense of rightness had forced even her father to reckon with his own failures. I see it now," her father murmured, voice barely above the wind. "I've been blind. You've shown me what it means to be a man." Jace simply nodded. There was no triumph in his gaze, only quiet acknowledgement. Redemption, it seemed, was not for the past, but for the choices made today. Clara, feeling a strange warmth in her chest, finally understood. She had witnessed something rare in this harsh frontier. A man who could live with honor in a world built on fear. A man who could survive betrayal and still offer mercy. And as the sun vanished behind the horizon, leaving the desert bathed in violet shadows, she realized that the life she had once thought stolen from her had been returned, not by law, not by luck, but by the man who had defied every expectation of the frontier. For the first time, she felt not fear, not anger, not shame, but gratitude, and something else, something more daring. Love, quietly blazing like the last light on the ridge. The first light of morning crept over the red hills, turning the desert into a sea of gold and copper. The wind had softened to a gentle breeze, carrying with it the scent of sagebrush and distant pine. For Clara Weston, the world had never looked so alive, or so full of possibility. She stood on the ridge beside Jace Redhawk, watching as he saddled the horses for the day's work. The cabin behind them, modest but sturdy, bore the marks of storms weathered and labor endured. It was home now, and in its walls they had both found something neither expected: peace. "Morning," Clara said softly, brushing a stray curl from her face. Jace glanced at her, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Morning. Sleep well?" "I did," she admitted, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the sun. For the first time in a long time, he offered her the reins and she took them, letting her hands rest alongside his. There was a rhythm in their movements, unspoken and natural. It was no longer the forced proximity of a bride and a man she barely knew. It was partnership, trust, and the quiet understanding born of shared trials. They rode down the ridge together, the desert unfolding before them in endless waves of color and light. Traders passed by, tipping hats and nodding with newfound respect, murmuring stories of Jace's courage, of the night he had defended Clara and survived the storm. The men who had once whispered lies about him now rode in silence, acknowledgement etched in their faces. Clara glanced at Jace as they reached the corral. He was no longer just the man she had been forced to marry. He was a protector, a teacher, a man who had rewritten every law of the frontier by living honorably in a world that often had no rules. "You've changed the town," she said quietly, almost to herself. He shrugged, humbled despite the truth in her words. They only needed to see the truth. "Sometimes it takes time." Clara laughed softly, a sound that felt like sunlight itself. "It took me longer than anyone else." He caught her hand, fingers brushing hers, and she felt that spark again. Quiet, steady, undeniable. She didn't pull away. She couldn't. Together they tended the small ranch, rebuilding fences, tending the animals, and planting the first rows of a modest garden. Life was hard, as it always had been in the desert, but it was theirs. Built not on debt or shame, but on courage, respect, and the kind of love that had been forged in storms and tempered in silence. One afternoon, as the sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of fire, Clara leaned against the cabin doorway, watching Jace ride across the field. The man who had been an outcast, a supposed criminal, and a stranger had become the center of her world. She felt no fear now, only trust, gratitude, and something far deeper: love. The wind carried the distant cry of a hawk, the rustle of leaves, and the faint laughter of a woman who had finally found her place. The frontier could be cruel, unforgiving, and wild, but it could also offer redemption, honor, and a chance to rewrite one's story. Clara turned to Jace as he dismounted, sun casting long shadows over the desert. He approached her, the same quiet strength she had learned to rely on, the same unwavering courage that had kept them alive through storms, threats, and fear. "You ready for today?" he asked. She smiled, feeling the weight of the past lift from her shoulders. "Yes," she said, voice steady. "I'm ready for every day as long as it's with you." He took her hand, their fingers entwining naturally, and together they walked toward the cabin. Behind them, the red hills glowed in the morning light, the desert stretching endless and free. Clara Weston had been forced to marry a poor Apache at 19, but she had discovered something far greater than wealth, status, or approval. She had found a man who defied the rules of the frontier, a love born not of necessity but of courage and respect. And as the new dawn rose over the desert, she knew their story, and their lives were theirs alone to shape, in a land where the horizon promised endless possibility. The past was behind them. The frontier had been rewritten, and for Clara and Jace a new life had begun.